You wake up on a Wednesday in January. You walk to the kitchen, you look at the calendar, and the calendar is wrong because your village ignored the 1752 switch to the Gregorian system, and you are celebrating Christmas Day today on the 6th. Your nearest pub is across the open sea. Your nearest hospital is 120 miles away. The postboat hasn't been able to land for 9 days because the wind is doing something Atlantic and personal. 17 people live on your island, and one of them is the dog. This is not a Hallmark film about ye olde Britain. This is regular life on Foula, Shetland, the most remote permanently inhabited island in the United Kingdom. And we have not even mentioned the bombing range yet, or the Welsh island with 3 full-time residents that's officially designated as a dark sky sanctuary, or the Shetland village whose population collapsed because the residents fell out over a dead dog. Britain tends to get described as London plus a bit of countryside, and the countryside tends to get described as a Cotswolds Airbnb with terrible Wi-Fi. None of that prepares anyone for what we are about to look at, because once you head north of Inverness, west of basically anywhere, or off the coast of basically anywhere else, you start finding villages that exist on a different operating system entirely. Communities where the population could not fill a London tube carriage. Places where the council combines your census data with another island just to protect your anonymity. Where you can be physically attached to mainland Britain and still have absolutely no road to the rest of the country. Where a NATO bombing range and your kitchen share a postcode. Today, we are counting down the 12 most isolated villages in the United Kingdom and answering the one question no Sunday supplement asks honestly, which is why anyone in their right mind still lives in them. If you are into the deeply weird corners of British geography, hit subscribe and tap the bell, because we do this kind of thing every week. A like helps the algorithm and costs you nothing, unlike a winter trip to any of these places, which costs absolutely everything. Let's start the countdown at number 12. Number 12. Rathlin Island, County Antrim, Northern Ireland. Starting in Northern Ireland because Rathlin is the only inhabited offshore island the country has, and that fact alone gives it a kind of stubborn dignity. This L-shaped lump of basalt sits 6 miles off Ballycastle, and the most recent census put the permanent population at 141, although in summer the visitor count can hit 50,000. The hook here is a cave, a king and a spider. Back in 1306, Robert the Bruce was hiding from the English on Rathlin under the protection of an Irish family called the Bissets, and legend has it he sat in a sea cave watching a spider try, fail and try again to spin a web. The spider eventually succeeded. Bruce went back to Scotland, won at Bannockburn, and the cave is still there. Visiting it is theoretically possible. Most people do not try, because Rathlin's cliffs treat outsiders the way a London bouncer treats a stag party. 600 years after Bruce, in 1898, Marconi sent the world's first commercial wireless transmission from Rathlin's East Lighthouse to Ballycastle. So this tiny island has hosted a fugitive future king and the birth of commercial radio, while the rest of us are using AirPods to ignore our family. Here is what nobody tells you. The ferry runs year-round, but Rathlin sits at the latitude where Atlantic weather and Irish weather get into a fight, and the boat sometimes loses. McQuaig's Bar is the island's only pub, and in 2006 a driveway extension there uncovered Bronze Age burials whose DNA pushes back genetic continuity in the modern Irish population by more than 1,000 years. None of this seems to surprise the locals. The 141 people who live on Rathlin stay for the same reasons people stay in any small island community. Family has been on the rock for generations. Tourism pays. Fishing keeps going. And after a few months on the mainland, the silence on Rathlin starts to sound like the only thing they actually want to listen to. Number 11. Isle of Eigg, Inner Hebrides, Scotland. Eigg is roughly 5 miles by 3, dominated by a basalt ridge called Anscour that looks like someone left a slice of cake out in the rain for 60 million years. About 110 people live here, which sounds underwhelming until you find out how Eigg got its current population, because this is the island that bought itself. For most of the 20th century, Eigg was passed around between absentee landlords like a hot potato no one wanted to hold. The most famous of them, an Englishman called Keith Schellenberg, ran the place until 1995 and left after what local reporting politely described as violent intimidation. Replacing him was an eccentric German artist who went by the single name Maruma and who reportedly told residents he could see auras around the cliffs. They did not love that. On the 12th of June 1997, the Isle of Eigg Heritage Trust, a partnership of residents, the Highland Council and the Scottish Wildlife Trust, completed the purchase of the entire island for £1.5 million, funded by donations from around the world. School children in New Zealand sent in pocket money. IG became the model for community land buyouts in Scotland, and the population has grown from around 65 in 1997 to roughly 110 today. Here's the part nobody tells you. In 2008, they switched on Eigg Electric, a renewable grid combining hydro, wind and solar that made Eigg the first island community in the world running 100% on green power. Households are capped at 5 kilowatts, businesses at 10. There is a traffic light system that asks people to cut consumption when the reservoirs run low. So while the rest of the country is panicking about energy bills, Eigg has been quietly running its own grid for 17 years on a budget the size of a Premier League player's hair transplant. For atmosphere though, picture this. Back in 1577, a MacLeod raiding party suffocated the entire MacDonald population of Eigg, around 395 people, inside Massacre Cave by lighting fires at the entrance. The bones remained visible inside the cave well into the 19th century. So when residents talk about island resilience, they mean it on a level the rest of us cannot really understand. Number 10. Papastour, Shetland. Now to the island whose population dropped because the residents fell out over a dead dog. That is not a setup for a joke. That is what locals will actually tell you happened. Papastour sits about a mile off the west coast of Shetland mainland, 3 square miles of cliffs and the most spectacular sea caves in Britain. The population peaked at 380 in the 19th century. By the 1970s, it had dropped to 16, prompting a resident known as Captain Calamity, real name Billy Tulloch, to run national newspaper adverts trying to recruit new settlers. It worked, briefly. Several English families relocated. Then the locals and the incomers had a series of disputes which culminated in the dead dog incident of around 2005, after which several families left, and the population has hovered between 6 and 15 ever since. The 2011 census recorded 15 residents. Recent local reporting puts the number closer to single digits. The island is officially clinging to existence. Then there's Stuart Hill, another resident, also known as Captain Calamity, in the most confusing piece of local naming in Shetland. In 2008, Hill declared the 1-hectare offshore islet of Forwick home to be the independent Crown dependency of Forwick. His argument was that Shetland was pledged as dowry by Christian I of Norway to James III of Scotland in 1468. The dowry was technically never redeemed, and therefore Shetland still belongs to Norway, and Forwick should secede. The international community did not respond. Forwick exists on a website. Access to Papastour is by a small ferry called the Snolder from West Burrowfirth, 5 days a week, 45 minutes if the wind permits. There is a reconstructed medieval Norse Stouffer house, built in 2008 on the foundations of one excavated in the 1970s, because in the Middle Ages this island was a serious place. Suspected lepers were once banished here. The 1299 document found at Darbiggings is the oldest surviving written record from Shetland. The 8 or so people who remain stay for mixed reasons. Some are crofters whose families have been there for centuries. Some are owner-occupiers from the English home counties who bought property online and never actually visited first. The rest are stubborn enough that watching the population fall further only makes them more determined to keep the lights on. Number 9. Holy Island of Lindisfarne, Northumberland, England. Lindisfarne breaks the pattern of this list because the population sits at 151. The cottages have running water and broadband, and the village contains 2 pubs and a winery that makes mead. On paper, it should not qualify. And then twice every 24 hours, the entire place vanishes from the road network. The mile-long causeway connecting Holy Island to the Northumberland coast disappears under the North Sea, and for several hours at a stretch, Lindisfarne is genuinely cut off from Britain. Tourists get this wrong constantly. Drivers misread the tide tables, panic mid-causeway, abandon their cars, and clamber onto stilted refuge huts that the council had to build because so many people kept getting stranded. Every year, between 10 and 20 vehicles need rescuing by the Coast Guard or the RNLI, sometimes from the bonnet, sometimes from the roof. The cars themselves get written off by the saltwater. What nobody tells you is that the residents adore this. The tide cuts the day trippers off twice a day and gives the islanders their village back, complete with the priory ruins, the Luthians' restored castle, and the small harbour where seals haul out on the rocks. Around 650,000 day trippers visit Lindisfarne every year. The locals get the place to themselves between the tides, like a recurring private hire. The history is also borderline absurd. St. Aidan founded a monastery here in 635. The Lindisfarne Gospels were created in this village around the year 700. On the 8th of June 793, a Viking raid hit the monastery, and historians generally treat that morning as the start of the Viking Age in Britain. 1100 years later, families still live above the same harbour the longships pulled into. The mead is still made on the island at St. Aidan's winery from a family recipe nobody outside the building has ever seen. A small primary school of around 24 children runs next to the priory's foundations. Life on Lindisfarne is structured entirely around the tide tables, and people who live there know their week, every week, by what the moon is doing. Number 8. Lundy Island, Bristol. Channel, Devon. Lundy is what happens when you take a 3-mile-long island and let one slightly eccentric owner run it for 40 years. About 28 permanent residents live there at any given time, which is roughly the cast of a Richard Curtis film, and they all work for the Landmark Trust, which manages the island for the National Trust. Back in 1929, the then owner, a man called Martin Coles Harmon, decided he wanted Lundy to issue its own currency. He printed coins denominated in half puffins and puffins, where 1 puffin equaled 1 penny, because of course it did. The Coinage Act of 1870 took a different view. Harmon was prosecuted, found guilty, and fined £5 and 15 shillings and 9 pence in April 1930. A first edition of the puffin coin today will set you back roughly £400 on a good day at auction. Lundy still issues its own postage stamps called puffinage stamps, and you stick them on your envelope alongside Royal Mail stamps before posting. The island has its own post office to handle this. Getting to Lundy is the joke nobody told you about. From April to October, the MS Oldenburg ferry runs 3 days a week from Bideford or Ilfracombe, and the crossing takes around 2 hours. From November to March, the ferry stops, and the only access is by helicopter from Hartland Point on Mondays and Fridays, between noon and 2 in the afternoon. Miss the helicopter and you wait 3 days. If the weather grounds the helicopter, you wait longer. There is one pub, the Morisco Tavern, which doubles as the village hall, the gossip exchange, and the only source of evening entertainment for the entire population. 2 German Heinkel. He-111 bombers crash-landed on Lundy during the Second World War. England's first statutory marine nature reserve was created in the seas around it. Soay sheep, sika deer, feral goats, wild Lundy ponies, and a unique endemic plant called the Lundy cabbage all live on the island. The cabbage is real, scientifically classified, and worth a Google later. Most of the 28 residents are on rotational tenure with the trust, which means they sign up to live in slow motion for a few years and then leave. The warden and the farmer are the long stayers. The puffins, of course, were here first. Number 7. Fair Isle, Shetland. Fair Isle is the most geographically remote permanently inhabited island in the entire United Kingdom, sitting halfway between Shetland and Orkney with absolutely nothing else for 24 miles in any direction. Latest figures from the Shetland Partnership put the population at 49. This is a community where every adult was vaccinated against COVID in a single morning, because they pulled the doses up by plane and got it done before lunch. The primary school currently has 4 pupils. Children leave at age 11 to board in Lerwick, because secondary education here would require a teacher commuting by Briton-Norman Islander, which is, in fact, what the few daily visitors actually do. The flight takes 25 minutes from Tingwall and gets cancelled by weather constantly. The alternative is a ferry called the Good Shepherd 4 that runs twice a week, and residents went 10 days without a boat in early 2021, and treated it like a normal Tuesday. The big hook here is knitwear. Fair Isle knitting is the global term for the stranded colourwork pattern technique that residents developed in the 19th century, with the geometric patterns and the staggered colour bands. After the Prince of Wales wore a Fair Isle pullover in 1921, the pattern became globally famous and is still being copied by every fashion brand from Brora to Uniqlo. The actual island makes very little money from the global association, which feels about right for British heritage industries generally. For context, picture this. In September 1588, the flagship of the Spanish Armada, El Gran Grifón, wrecked on Fair Isle. 300 Spanish sailors made it to shore, where 17 island families had to host them for 6 weeks. 50 of the Spaniards died of starvation that winter. Eventually, the survivors were ferried to Shetland mainland, and the islanders went back to a quiet life that, 400 years later, still revolves around the same kind of weather, the same fish, and the same impossibly slow internet. The Fair Isle Bird Observatory burned down in 2019 and reopened in a brand new building in 2024. Over 27 species have been logged here as a first record for Britain. So while the rest of us argue about whether starlings are pests, the people of Fair Isle have a small wooden building where international ornithologists wait for the next vagrant from Siberia to fly in confused and exhausted. Number 6. North Ronaldsay, Orkney. The northernmost Orkney Island has a population of 59, a 13-mile dry stone wall, and a flock of sheep that eat seaweed. That last sentence is not a metaphor. The dike is real. It is 6 feet tall, and Historic Scotland classifies it as probably the largest dry stone construction conceived as a single entity anywhere in the world. Built in 1832 after the kelp industry collapsed, the dike encircles the entire island, penning the native sheep onto a 271-acre strip of foreshore. The reason was economic. The laird wanted the inland for cattle, so the sheep were exiled to the beach. 200 years later, those sheep have evolved into the only land mammal apart from the Galapagos marine iguana to live on a diet that's roughly 80% kelp. Their stomachs are now physiologically unable to process much grass. Move them inland and they die of copper poisoning. The dike is not just a wall, it is a life support system. Maintenance falls to 11 elected sheepmen, an institution called the Sheep Court that has been operating since 1839. Storms in December 2012 destroyed miles of the dike, and the current population cannot repair it alone. So since 2016, the island has run a sheep festival every summer where volunteers from around the world fly in to rebuild it. It is, no kidding, a working dry stone holiday. Getting there is harder than getting to most places mentioned in this video. The ferry from Kirkwall runs once a week in winter. Loganair flies subsidised 8-seat planes if you stay overnight. North Ronaldsay mutton was served to Queen Elizabeth at her Diamond Jubilee, which is the kind of soft power flex that only happens when your sheep eat seaweed and your wall is on the world stage. The population peaked at 547 in 1881. The current 59 includes a handful of new arrivals, including a retired couple called Malcolm and June Purvis, who in 2022 moved to North Ronaldsay with their pony Zara. Zara was lifted off the ferry by crane. That single fact tells you everything about the level of effort required to live here. Number 5. Scoraig, Wester Ross, Scottish Highlands. Most of this list features people who got stuck somewhere remote because of family or geography or the slow inertia of generations. Scoraig is different. The roughly 80 to 100 people living on this peninsula chose to be here, and they chose to make their lives substantially harder than they had to be. Scoraig sits north of Ullapool, on a spit of land jutting into Little Loch Broom. It cannot be reached by car. There is no road. The only way in is a 5-mile walk over rough hill from a place called Badralach, or a 1-mile boat trip across the loch from Badluarach. There is no mains electricity. There is no mains water. The peninsula is not on the national grid. Every household generates its own power, mostly through home-built wind turbines, plus solar panels, hydro setups, and backup diesel for emergencies. The 1871 census recorded 380 Gaelic-speaking inhabitants. Population dwindled across a century until 1963, when the last native crofter, a man called Billy McRae, packed up and left. The peninsula was empty. Then, in the 1970s, an in-migration began of what the local newspapers at the time called a hippie commune. Engineers, woodworkers, dropouts, and serious thinkers about how to live without a grid. The current population includes children whose parents were themselves born on Scoraig. A multi-generational off-grid community is a contradiction in terms in most of the world, but here it works. Hugh Pigott, a long-time Scoraig resident, is internationally known for designing the home-built wind turbines now used in off-grid communities globally. He runs courses. He has shipped his designs everywhere from Malawi to Mongolia. There is a primary school, there is no shop, there is no pub, there is no doctor. A resident, when asked by the BBC why anyone would do this, gave the line that captures the entire community. "We have deliberately made our lives harder. The rest of us are sitting in heated flats panicking about smart meter readings, while they are 200 miles north building turbines from car parts and getting on with it." Number 4. Inverary and the Knoydart Peninsula, Lochaber, Scotland. Knoydart is not an island, and that is important, because Inverary, its main village, is officially the most isolated village on mainland Britain, and Inverary sits on the actual British mainland. You cannot drive to it. There is no road from the rest of the UK road network to Knoydart. The peninsula is sandwiched between Loch Nevis, which translates as Loch Heaven, and Loch Horn, which translates as Loch Hell. Make of that what you will. Around 100 to 120 people live on the peninsula, most of them in Inverary itself. Reaching them takes a 30-minute ferry from Mallaig, or, if you fancy it, a 2 to 3 day mountain hike from Glenfinnan through some of the roughest terrain in Scotland. People do this for fun. They are wrong, but they do it. The reason this entry sits at number 4 is the pub. The Old Forge has been a working pub since the 1770s and holds the Guinness World Record for the most remote pub on mainland Britain. After a fractious decade under a private owner who locals say alienated half the village, the community decided to buy it. Over 14 months, the residents of Knoydart raised £320,000 through a community share offer involving 90 of the roughly 110 people on the peninsula. On the 28th of March 2022, the keys were handed over to the Old Forge Community Benefit Society, and the pub reopened on the 15th of April 2022. The community now owns the most remote pub in mainland Britain, runs it themselves, and serves you a pint after your 2-day hike in. There is also The Table, which is technically not a pub. It started as a plank of wood and grew into a tarpaulined drinking shack with a fire pit, a disco ball, and a Facebook page. Locals describe it as the legally not a pub spirit pub. There is no bank. There is no ATM. There is no Tesco. The Knoydart Brewery operates from a former chapel. The deeper story here is the 7 men of Knoydart. Back in 1948, 7 Second World War veterans staked land claims on the estate of Lord Brocket, a notorious Nazi sympathiser, in protest at how the peninsula was being managed. They lost in court, but the cairn at Inverary still commemorates them, and the spirit of that protest fed directly into the 1999 community buyout of 17,500 acres of the Knoydart estate. People stay because they own the place now, in every sense that matters. Number 3. Bardsey Island, Gwynedd, Wales. The year-round population of Bardsey Island in 2025 is 3 people, not 30. 3. Bardsey, or Ynys Enlli to use its Welsh name, sits 1.9 miles off the tip of the Llyn Peninsula in northwest Wales, separated from the mainland by a sound where the tides do something best described as enthusiastic. The population peak was 132 in 1881, and the island has been emptying ever since. Today, the year-round residents number 3, with a handful of seasonal arrivals in summer, including the artist-in-residence and the tenant farmer. Tradition says that anyone buried on Bardsey will not go to hell. Medieval pilgrims believed 3 trips here equaled 1 to Rome. The island is known across Welsh history as the Island of 20,000 Saints, partly because excavations south of the chapel in the 1990s uncovered 25 medieval graves on a site that's barely 1.5 miles by half a mile. Whether or not 20,000 saints actually got buried in such a small piece of ground is a question for theologians. The bones, however, are real. Owned by the Bardsey Island Trust since 1977, the island had its 440-acre sheep tenancy advertised in the year 2000, and it received 1,100 applications. By 2023, Bardsey had become Europe's first international dark sky sanctuary, a designation given because there is, quite literally, no light pollution within 12 miles of the place. Residents will tell you that on a clear night, you can see structure in the Milky Way that most British people have never seen in their lives. The last king of Bardsey was a man called Love Pritchard. He was crowned in 1925 at the age of 80 and died 2 years later. His final request was that his crown be displayed at the National Museum in Cardiff. The crown is still there. Picture this last detail. There is one apple tree on Bardsey, growing by a building called Plasbach. In 1998, botanists confirmed that this tree is the world's only example of a unique apple cultivar. They named it the Bardsey apple. There are now commercial orchards growing it, descended entirely from cuttings of one tree on an island where 3 people live full-time. People stay on Bardsey because they applied to. The trust appoints residents through long waiting lists, and living there is the prize. Most of us have never wanted anything as much as some people want to live on a Welsh island with no Wi-Fi and the universe overhead. Number 2. Cape Wrath, Sutherland, Scotland. Cape Wrath is the most northwesterly point on the British mainland. It is the only place in the Northern Hemisphere where NATO forces train using combined live-fire land, sea and air assault. And it is also the home of 2 permanent residents, John Ura and his daughter Angela, who run Britain's most isolated cafe out of the lighthouse keeper's old quarters and rent out the lighthouse machine room as a bunkhouse for £5 a night. That paragraph deserves a second read. 2 permanent residents, living next to a NATO bombing range, running a cafe, renting out a £5 bunkhouse on the most northwesterly point of mainland Britain. None of this is satire. The road in question is the U70. Getting to Cape Wrath requires 3 things. A passenger ferry across the Kyle of Durness, which runs only between May and September, and only when the tide permits. A privately operated minibus from the ferry terminal, which drives the 11-mile unsurfaced track to the lighthouse, and the cooperation of the Ministry of Defence, who can close the road and the entire peninsula at any time the Cape Wrath Training Centre is in active use, which means whenever bombs of up to £1,000 are being dropped on Garvey Island just offshore. The name has nothing to do with anger. It comes from the Old Norse word varf, meaning turning point, used by Vikings as a navigation reference for sailing home. The headland has the highest cliffs anywhere on the British mainland, at 281 metres, called Clough Moor. Back in January 1983, the area recorded just 38 minutes of total sunshine for the entire month, which remains a Scottish record. Wind gusts of 140 miles per hour have been documented on the Cape. Robert Stevenson built the lighthouse in 1828, and it was automated in 1998. The MOD has tried to expand its land holdings several times. The Ure family has resisted several times. Walkers on the Cape Wrath Trail, the 200-mile route from Fort William, finish their journey at the cafe, eat soup, sign the visitor's book, and walk back the way they came. The reason the Ures stay is some combination of family attachment, the beauty of the place when nobody is shooting at the headland, and a kind of stubborn refusal to let the MOD treat the most northwesterly point of Britain as if no one is watching. They live there because watching is the job. Number 1. Foula, Shetland, Scotland. The hooks here are stacked one on top of another. Foula has a permanent population of 17 according to the 2022 Scottish census. The island still observes the Julian calendar, meaning Christmas Day on Foula is the 6th of January and Old New Year falls on the 13th. In 1720, a smallpox epidemic killed roughly 9 out of every 10 people on the island. The cliffs of Darkham on the western side rise to 376 metres, or 1,233 feet, making them among the highest sheer sea cliffs in Britain. Michael Powell filmed The Edge of the World on Foula in 1937, a film about the evacuation of St Kilda which Foula was used to stand in for, and the island has been the edge of the world in popular British imagination ever since. Fula sits 20 miles west of the Shetland mainland in open ocean. The ferry, the New Advance, takes 12 passengers and runs twice a week from Walls when the weather allows. Airtask flies a Briton-Norman Islander from Tingwall when the weather allows, which is a phrase that does a lot of work this far north. The local boat is hauled out of the water rather than docked, because Fula does not really have a harbour. It has a beach, a winch, and the assumption that the Atlantic will eventually stop trying to drown you. What nobody outside the British Isles really understands is the Julian calendar thing. When Britain switched from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar in 1752, Parliament removed 11 days from the calendar overnight. There were riots in some places about lost wages. Fula, separated from London by 600 miles of bad weather and indifference, simply refused to update. The shift then was 11 days, and Fula's calendar still runs 12 days behind because of the rolling difference. So when the rest of the country is unwrapping presents on the 25th of December, Fula is going about its Tuesday. 12 days later, when everyone else is back at work hating their email, Fula is opening presents. The economy is crofting, the unique, unmodernised Fula sheep and seabird tourism. The Kames clifftops in summer host great skuas, puffins and Arctic terns. There is no pub. There is no shop. The community trust runs the renewables network that keeps the lights on. The school has 4 pupils. Children leave at 11 to board in Lerwick. The reason 17 people still live on this island is straightforward when you stop looking for a clever answer. They live there because their parents lived there, and their grandparents lived there, and at some point the connection to the place became deeper than the connection to anything outside it. They live there because the calendar that the rest of the world keeps is not the only valid calendar. They live there because the Atlantic, which has tried to take Fula many times, has so far failed. That, in the end, is the answer to the question this entire video is built around. People still live in these villages because nobody else has been able to convince them to stop. What this list shows, ultimately, is that isolation in Britain is not just a matter of geography. The villages on Fula, Cape Wrath, Bardsey, Knoydart and the rest are not failures of modern infrastructure. They are deliberate cultures. People stay because the silence is worth more than the convenience. Because owning your village outright matters more than mains electricity. Because your sheep eat seaweed and your church is consecrated. And your apple tree is unique. And your calendar is older than the United Kingdom. And none of that should change just because the rest of the world wants it to. Question for the comments section. Could you actually live in any of the 12 villages on this list, or would you crack inside a week? Be honest about it. We read the comments, and the lying ones tend to be the most fun. Subscribe, ring the bell, leave a comment. We will see you next video.